Google's benefit was almost in some ways its Achilles heel because of the instant gratification of the results that you're able to see and proving the worth. Because in many cases, it was one of those first drivers to really help marketers prove, especially in the healthcare space with all the regulatory constraints, that we are and can be a revenue generating resource for the organization. It's not going to necessarily work for every service line because, again, that awareness is important, but there are clearly very specific ones where we can show that we are moving the needle as far as getting people to schedule appointments and actually have the appointments, and then looking at the downstream revenue of those potential things.
So I've been talking to marketing leaders over the last few weeks, and everyone is really bullish on spending more time and more energy into brand, but they continue to be anchored in paid search. Why? Because it's hard to measure, and as everyone knows, like budgets are under increased scrutiny, so that makes it even harder to move into new channels. So I thought, who better as a tour guide than someone who's blended brand and performance over the last 2 decades? I've got Scott Orstad he's Vice President of Marketing at Catholic Health with me today. Welcome. Great to see you.
Great to see you too, Ray.
So, hey, I want to kick it off with, we all know if you've been in performance marketing for a while, we all know that Google paid search is probably one of the greatest advertising platforms created in the history of marketing. It's very effective. It has a place in our strategies. And maybe I'll start with you tell me about in your strategy, where does search show up? What is the role of paid search for you today at Catholic Health?
Paid search is an important part of our overall media mix, but it's not the only one we utilize. We use a number of very digital performance focused tactics like paid search, social media, email marketing, coupling that all up with our CRM. And also mix that in with some of the more broader traditional marketing channels as well too, from television. We do a lot with video, as well as still doing direct mail and print advertising in situations where it makes sense. Healthcare is still an industry that is still a bit more paper marketing collateral than some of us would like it to be at, but at times, done the right way, they can be effective and complement a lot of those more performance digital-driven tactics.
Makes sense. Where do you see, I've personally built early stage startups, at least the first year or so, almost predominantly on paid search if you're in the right market. And so we know as like a high intent bottom of funnel strategy, it gets the unit economics people want. But I've seen in trying to scale the business, you reach a certain point, maybe you run out of headroom in these queries and these keywords that produce the results you want. And then you're like, oh God, what's next? There's no more room to grow anymore. Where have you seen search quietly fail for you?
I think healthcare is an industry where your people think of you in 2 different ways. Search works out great when they're looking for that immediate need because they're looking up one of your urgent care centers because they need it, or one of your ERs, or their primary care doctor told you they need a referral for a certain type of specialist. So there's that kind of in the moment need, which is where search works out great. But in general, people need to be aware that you exist in the first place and your services. And so that's where the little bigger brander marketing is important, so that you can remain top of mind from time to time. Because if you come up in the search results with 3 or 4 other competitors and no one has ever heard of you, you're likely not going to get the click anyway if someone is not familiar with you in the first place. So we have to build familiarity so that at that time, when someone's looking to take that convertible action where search works out so well, they actually have a general sense as to who we are and they've actually heard of us first.
Love that. Okay, this is the conversation that happens in the room, not necessarily from the marketing leader or the marketing team, but when other stakeholders come in, which is, hey, budgets are tight. Mm-hmm. It's hard to fight for net new budget, especially when testing new channels. This could come from the executive team, who knows, but hey, like, let's not, why would we move budget out of paid search? Like, you don't have net new budget. I better keep it all invested in my paid search strategy. Like, how, how do you like, if you're a voice in the room or a mentor in that situation, like, how would you coach that conversation?
I think a couple of things would depend upon where the organization is in its journey. I mean, we, like other organizations, are dealing with that same situation of,
Okay.
flat budgets. But what we've been doing is migrating from brand over to more the performance marketing tactics for a couple of reasons. One, as we relaunched the brand 5 years ago, there's more of that general awareness, so we can pivot some of it. But we also intentionally started growing it as we grew the digital capabilities. We made sure we launched the new website first, and we were happy with the content. So we didn't just start throwing paid search when we launched the brand because we didn't have the correct website at the time to be doing it with. And there's been a lot of cross synergy work done with our folks in digital technology and the call center to make sure we can more accurately attribute things. So until some of those infrastructure pieces were working correctly, we didn't ramp up search just for the sake of doing it. We wanted to make sure that if we were driving to that conversion, that the points that were allowing us to do that, whether it was scheduling online, calling the call center, could be able to handle the volume. And there was some sense of being able to show the metrics that it was actually working, because otherwise search could have fallen into the trap of being a more traditional kind of branding type tactic, which is harder to measure other than through awareness studies and other things of that nature.
You mentioned because you have a different view. I think it's been a little while, but we talked about this where you're making a shift from traditional brand tactics in some way to performance channels. Can you explain that a little bit more? Is it all, are you moving brand all to Google, or are you moving to a more digital strategy? Can you talk about what that means a little bit for you?
Sure, I meant moving to an overall more digital strategy.
Okay.
Paid search in Google is definitely a key priority to that. And over the last 3 to 4 years, we've continued to invest more in those areas. But that's also complemented with a very strong email marketing program. Complemented with our CRM system, and having that all kind of work together. You know, efficiently, utilizing organic and paid social media as appropriate based on the campaign and the target audience of the messaging that we're looking to do as well too. And then again, constantly looking at ways to enhance and refine the website. When we first launched it 5 years ago, a lot of it was about some of the things the features that we all liked from consumer brands at that time, for the conveniences they provided. But we all know now too, content's always been king, but content's becoming even bigger king again for having the updates and the clarity as we all are beginning to learn how to adapt for AI search along with the traditional search that's going on as well too. And so I think it's, one of the things that we just try to do is constantly evolve with what we're seeing in the marketplace, and not let the digital component become stagnant.
That makes sense. When you said at the top a little bit about, you said something that really resonates with me, and I've talked to other marketing leaders about this, which is Google is really great at capturing intent. Like someone is actively looking for something, but there's lots of things that show up in our health that I'm not really looking for it, but I might need it someday. And I don't know if I'm going to search for it in a Google query, even in an LLM. Like I may actually like go to the trusted brand because this
Right.
thing is so sensitive. When you think about moving beyond Google, and you think about like what are some of those awareness strategies that you're building, um, where do where do you start, or where did you start? Like what are some of the channels that you started with in order to do that job?
Yeah, we looked at it a lot as the foundation of our content marketing strategy, making sure we had the right type of content on the site that we could then utilize through social media and some of our different email marketing campaigns we had specific, or we've had some. We also have a number of very focused ones, broad ones for the system. Then for different, service lines, we have specific e-newsletters from a content perspective, and we've really found that has created a lot of engagement as well too. And you know because I think again we've built this ability to become a trusted resource, And that's part of it, because things like figuring out when to go to urgent care or making that primary care visit are pretty consumer driven. They can be a quick decision. But if someone gets a diagnosis of some sort of cardiac condition, or perhaps a cancer diagnosis, they're likely going to do a lot of research online, based on what family, friends, their physician tells them. So that's where a lot of the making sure that the content is structured the way you want it to be and accurately reflecting is important. And it's even, kind of going with talking about the whole Google perspective. While we as marketers are looking at it from that ability for someone, for that intent to make the conversion, we still have a lot of our medical leadership. They're just happy if folks, if we're at the top of the search, people click on us and just learn more about us. And I think there is still some validity to that, but I think the email marketing and the organic search and just the overall general brand awareness, that we do exist, and these are our service offerings, need to be able to help to better tell that story. So again, it's not something else that search has to be the only mechanism to get it across with.
That makes a lot of sense. I've heard you mention search, and I've heard you mention content, and the CRM play of like being able to engage with people in a more rich way, like an email newsletter. How do you think about, for the folks in your marketplace, how do you get them into the CRM so that you can engage them? Are there other strategies and other channels that you leverage first that casts a wider net and then pulls them into that deeper conversation? I'm just curious of like how would you build your newsletter list in your CRM?
Sure, it comes from a combination of two distinct audiences. One is those in which we have who have had at least an encounter with us in the last 2 years, so they have an account through Epic, and they get that kind of first outreach and have the ability to opt out if they so choose to. So there's kind of that built-in audience there. Then with a lot of the digital advertising and social media campaigns that we have, they'll drive folks to a landing page, to learn more information or to sign up for a newsletter. So people are voluntarily saying, hey, we want to learn more about Catholic health and its services. So it's kind of a combination of both pieces, because, we think it's important to try to get other new potential customers, because we do see patients as customers. We're in a very competitive marketplace where people do have choice. And so, we want to be able to, from our marketing efforts, attract people before they have that first encounter. So we kind of look at both, opportunities to engage with the community.
I love how you like being able to like get mind share before that first encounter so that they start to build
Yeah.
the trust for your brand. I'd love to, if you have like a campaign that you're proud of that your team worked on in that, like connecting with them before their first encounter. What did that look like? What was that campaign that ultimately earned the right to get them into your CRM?
Sure. So there's we've expanded our outpatient footprint significantly in the last 2 years to make care closer to home for various different communities. And these different outpatient centers are rooted with having primary care doctors there along with specialists. And so what we did is, again, using kind of a multi-channel approach that involved search, social media, email marketing, direct mail, and in some instances print advertising, making people aware these centers are now open and the different types of physicians and providers that are there for care. And we use different tracking mechanisms on all of the various tactics to see which ones we're pulling in. So some of them, we had data about some patients already in that marketplace and would send them information. But then obviously things such as the direct mail and social and others were more lead gen for folks we may or may not have had an interaction with. And so we tracked all of them to see which ones came in. And based on the marketplace, some of them varied. A lot of times, clearly search did well, but in many cases the direct mail, email, and social were the largest drivers for the new outpatient centers, because again, many maybe had seen them in the construction phase or driven by or seen the coming soon signs and things, but it was the once we started sharing the details with them, that's when it really became more tangible for them. And again, I think based on the types of services that were offered there as well too, that also helped to guide what sort of decisions they made.
When you initially framed that campaign to leadership, what was what did good look like? Was the goal to actually drive people, whether like thresholds of driving your consumers in those marketplaces to the new outpatient? What was the plan?
Sure. The ultimate goal was initially to drive awareness, although we knew that being able to show in appropriate situations that we had generated an appointment scheduled and actually occurring was important as well too, and that's something we've been able to do at those locations of primary care because of the online scheduling capabilities. We can see that if someone has used one of those tools, the tactics that we've had, if they actually schedule an appointment within a certain period of time after that tactic goes out. Because some of the times, too, what we would do is not necessarily launch the direct email and social all the same week. Sometimes we would tier them and kind of check besides the tracking mechanisms, whether it was UTM codes or QR codes or whatever we were using, dedicated phone lines, there were trackable URLs and such. Whatever the tracking mechanism was, we'd use that as well as a little bit of space and time as well too, to just to kind of see which one was gaining the most momentum for us.
Right, because you could measure like who is actually an active member of this campaign, and then what happened to those folks downstream. Where did that conversion typically show up? Did it still show up in Google? Was that like the last touch, or did people go, never touched Google and went straight to like booking an appointment? I'm just curious what that looked like downstream.
Sure, it was a combination of both. In some cases, it was directly to scheduling an appointment.
Yeah.
It's also another thing that we see too is that two of those outpatient centers that we opened, we also have an urgent care capabilities there. And in those cases, one of the new trends going on in urgent care that people like to do, it's called reserve your spot. And so before they get there, they can go to the website, click, and it'll kind of tell you what the potential wait might be, or they can kind of, in essence, soft schedule a time. And that was something else we started measuring as well, too, specifically for that part, or anytime we were doing specific urgent care promotion that was contained in those centers, was really about driving people about the awareness it was open, but suggesting that they reserve the spot, and we measure how many people are actually clicking on that feature to actually do it, and then reconcile it with the office staff afterwards on approximate numbers. Again, we don't know specifically who did it, but we know numbers of what the intent was, and then how many actually did it that day.
Google search is great because people are only going to look when they have intent where there's an injury or
Right.
something. But urgent cares are evolving a bit and are giving more holistic care, and that's something that like people aren't aware of, and Google doesn't necessarily solve that part, and the campaign you mentioned does.
Right. And even to that end, with the urgent care, that's one of those service line offerings where we do have a newsletter that we do just kind of keep top of mind with seasonal topics. And so anytime someone has gone to one of the centers, they in essence become part of that audience mailing list to receive the e-newsletter. So again, knowing that they had an experience with us, we want to make sure that next time they need urgent care services, that we come top of mind versus one of our competitors. So that's how through our email content marketing strategy, we kind of try to stay top of mind and also just build brand awareness when they're not using the services, when they're making that search on Google, when they quickly want to have that intent to schedule an appointment of some kind.
You're not the first person, it's 2026, and when I think about marketing today, it's such a digital focus, but print and direct mail has continued to come up in healthcare.
Yeah.
It's more prevalent than I ever had imagined it would be, but it makes sense a bit. I guess I'm curious for you, when you think about running a direct mail campaign like you mentioned, is it geo, like outside of the customer, outside of the patient pool you have, is it purely geo based, or are there other criteria that you're looking for to make sure that when I receive that piece that it impacts me and it's relevant to me? I'm just curious.
Sure. It's usually, foundationally based on a certain geo zip code, as you mentioned, right?
Yeah.
I think depending upon what it is too, it could also be based on some health criteria. So, for
Hmm.
example, when we open the outpatient centers, it's usually about a 5 mile radius, sometimes 10, depending upon the population density in the area. And that's really the key. We usually put some sort of an age disclaimer as well, too, usually sometimes 21 and above or 25 and above. But there are cases too where it might be about a particular service. About 2 years ago, I believe we started a specific cardiac screening type test. And so that was done through a combination of kind of two lists, one where it was very geo oriented and of a certain age. I think we target either over 40 or over 45. But we had some data about our own patients who had had an interaction with us before that
Hmm.
met some of the criteria that might make them eligible for that testing. So then we would get a more targeted response. And obviously, we saw more of a reaction from that targeted audience than we did the broader one, which is something we also typically see with our health risk assessments. We do that for a couple service lines, heart being our kind of key one. And there's no question that while search and social drive people to take the quiz, and we ultimately see appointments do getting scheduled, those that we make the outreach to through the email marketing after we've done the AI predictive analytics at taking this test and an appointment with a cardiologist may be beneficial for them, definitely seems to have a higher reaction, higher open rate, and because it was more focused for that particular individual.
Was that the campaign? Was that how the print campaign showed up? Is that did the print campaign was the call to action to come take this evaluation so we can help you understand if it's helpful or not?
Yep. So like whenever we utilize print, we always have either the URL or QR code that drives folks to that landing page. So again, even in the case of print, we're first saying, hey, did they scan the QR code? That gives us a sense on how many people are reacting. And it always goes
Yep.
to one of those pages where there is that kind of strong call to action to schedule an appointment by calling this number or the form fill or take this quiz so that we can kind of see, trying to make print as relevant and contemporary as it can be.
Yeah.
Because for some audiences, it is still an important tactic. Healthcare in general still is a little too comfortable with marketing collateral print and the infamous billboards, but
Right.
there are ways to still try to make them relevant to the media mix, and that's what we try to do whenever we can.
I love the value add on the call to action, which is like, oh, let's just help see if we're helpful at all before trying to like, drive you to one of our centers. That with the QR code itself, I'm assuming that like folks who scan the QR code can start to track down to like the recipient basically and see that's like your first step to see in the funnel. Like we know they're in the campaign and they receive the mail. Did they engage with it at all or not?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's really the whole intent because it also helps us
Yeah.
with those more generalized broader tactics like print and direct mail and things like that to
Yeah.
be able to keep them as part of the media mix because now there's a way to see if they are what sort of results they are generating. And at some of those outpatient centers the direct mail pieces and even print advertising in some of the weekly papers actually did prove to be beneficial. In other markets not so much. It just really
Sure.
depended upon the geography, but it was a good test to actually show leadership that sometimes it can work, sometimes it doesn't. You just have to trust us that we'll kind of make that decision as far as when to make it a part of the mix because we may have a menu of 10 options, but all 10 options may not work every time. Sometimes it's three or four. And I think it's adapting to each campaign and what the ultimate goal is. Is it simply about awareness because something is now open? Or do we have that ability to have folks kind of make that converted action of scheduling an appointment? And so that's why we try to specifically pick the tactics based on what the overall outcome of the campaign is.
What you just said really, like, I think this is the thing that Google ruined us because Google works in such a predictable way. Like, it really becomes around the intent of the keywords. Pretty much for every service or product people can sell, you could find some money keywords that will convert paying people. It's just like how much room. The rest of marketing is there. That's why we have to experiment and we have to measure because not everything will work or not everything will work all the time or not everything will work by location or not everything will work with this particular consumer. And that's like, you can't not do it at all because it's not universal. You have to
Right.
like play around with the levers and see like what combination of things. But we've completely, it's like Google obliterated that like mindset of marketing in a way.
Right. Yeah, Google's benefit was almost in some ways its Achilles heel because of the instant gratification of the results that you're able to see and proving the worth. Because in many cases, it was one of those first drivers to really help marketers prove, especially in the healthcare space with all the regulatory constraints, that we are and can be a revenue generating resource for the organization. It's not going to necessarily work for every service line because again, that awareness is important, but there is clearly very specific ones where we can show that we are moving the needle as far as getting people to schedule appointments and actually have the appointments, and then looking at the downstream revenue of those potential things. And I think one of the important things is as you're able to generate the metrics, it's working with leadership and trying to get their buy-in as early as possible in small chunks,
Yeah.
because then I think it becomes more believable for them. That was actually something that worked for us really well, is getting specifically with our CRM results as far as campaigns we were sending out, knowing that people had scheduled appointments and actually followed through with them after in a certain period of time frame. Everyone agreed upon what that time frame was. We were showing the ICD-9 and 10 codes that we were taking credit for. And even in particular, in one campaign, we had this one where it was called No Primary Care Emergency Department. And simply what that was is if someone came to one of our emergency departments and they didn't have a primary care listed in their medical record, they would get an email from us the next day thanking them for choosing one of our 6 Catholic health emergency departments, indicating we knew that they didn't have a primary care listed. And if in fact that was true, here's how you could develop a relationship with one of our primary care doctors.
Love that.
And for that follow-up case, and was well received by the service line as well as even members of leadership. And some even pointed out, well, people may need more than just a primary care follow-up, because orthopedics and a couple other service lines are very common follow-ups that happen after someone has an ER visit. And they're like, maybe you should consider those in the mix. And so we took that kind of conservative approach by just looking at the primary care follow-up, and here leadership was suggesting, let's take a look at the numbers if we add some of these other ones into the mix and determine whether we want to count those as well. And so that was really inspiring to hear that financial leadership was willing to work with us, again, because I think we had a very open and transparent relationship with them as far as what we were trying to take credit for and how we got there, and it was believable to them.
You mentioned something I wanted to touch on, so it feels like a good place to transition, is you were able to have that conversation with your financial leaders and continue to get their buy-in. In what you described as that flow, obviously the ability to track that and measure that is so critical to go to your financial leadership. What if someone is just really heavily anchored in Google and hasn't been able to like deploy this kind of strategy and campaign? What's the practical approach here? Like maybe two parts. How do you go have this conversation with financial leadership to let them know the journey that you're going on together? And then two, how do you think about the MVP way? Because not everyone has like data science team, and that's going to be one of the blockers. How do you practically measure this so that you can go back to them and say, I told you this is what we're going to do. Here's how it's showing up in the results.
Yeah, I think it has to foundationally start with the campaign and what's the ability for tracking for, and can you
Okay.
show that it's ultimately you're leading to a scheduled appointment. And I think if you can work with, you know, IT and financial teams before and to kind of make that connection piece first to show that there's a way to show that whether it's using Google specifically as your tactic or if you have other ones in tandem with that, that you're able to show that it resulted in scheduled appointments. And I think that that's the foundational key, because you need to have something to show them with, because then you can then have the conversation about we were able to prove that we did this. And in a lot of cases, sometimes it's that complement with the medical record that you're using as well too. We are an Epic shop, so that helps to provide a little bit more flexibility as far as being able to show some level of tracking. And then I think you can then present the conversation with leadership to talk about kind of take them on the steps of the journey of how you got to where you are, and then have that open conversation about, well, if we're going to start measuring these primary care visits or urgent care visits that we help to
Yeah.
lead, what is, do we want to attribute a certain cost per appointment, or do we want to use it based on the type of insurance that the patient had? And so we can start seeing the benefit that it had as far as what it brought in from a revenue, and then you obviously start utilizing what the cost of the campaign were to see how it really benefited the organization. And then I think based on the capabilities of the group, you just try to keep scaling that by campaign as it makes sense, and can just continue to have that ongoing dialogue to make sure there was the buy-in. Because again, I think for us, I'm very fortunate that I have a senior leadership team that is supportive of marketing first and foremost, and
Yeah.
that definitely helps, as well as leadership that understands that we do and can help impact the organization financially. And it's more than just about awareness and brand familiarity. And so that willingness just to be able to have the dialogue was huge and exceptionally helpful. But I also think taking that kind of showing them the journey of how we were getting there, taking a conservative approach as far as what we were willing to take credit for initially, then allowed to get the buy-in, and we could then start scaling it up a little bit as far as maybe it goes to more of a medium conservative approach, because again, they saw the path we were taking. They knew, what types of services we were trying to take credit for. And then they realized it just wasn't a bunch of stuff thrown at them that didn't make sense. We were kind of in essence speaking their language from the patient journey to the ICD-9 and 10 codes.
I love that. Yeah, you I think we talked about this, and you took a conservative approach too on what you were going to take credit for so that you could like continue to earn that trust versus just a
Right.
more like, well, we're going to get credit for everything here. You were practical. When you think about because Google paid search is always going to be part of the strategy, and one of the arguments that people face is like, well, just don't take away from Google, keep spending there. But I'm a marketer, and I'm gonna follow your path and say, hey, I actually could get more out of that spend if I take part of it away and put it into this direct mail campaign or some other version of that that's relevant for your market. How do you think about that comparison in that experiment? Like, here's where our baseline was before. Are you expecting, like, let's say you drove X number of patients to this center just with Google, and then you take a more blended approach. Is your ultimate expectation that you would drive like 1.2x patients? So like, would there be a bump at the bottom that would be required to be successful, or are there other KPIs that would also be like directionally indicative of like success for you?
Sure. I think it ultimately comes down, each campaign is looked upon differently as far as what's possible. And again, in some cases, the online scheduling component is there, and that's obviously a huge way as far as showing the
Yeah.
success. In other cases, it isn't. So is it generating qualified calls, or is it the form fills? And so it's, in some cases, we have all three options open to us.
Yeah.
So, it just really depends. And that's what we have tried to do is there's no cookie cutter approach to it. There's no universal way. And that's why we said there's a menu of options. And we have to figure out which ones are the right options to select for that individual campaign. We're, doing a lot of rapid growth on the online scheduling component, which is going to be great. Our digital technology team is working rapidly on that, and that's going to be a great benefit, for us in marketing, because that will really help that component up. But so right now, while we're waiting for that to happen in some of our specialty areas, we do need to deploy some of these other, tactics so that we can help to prove beyond just a Google click that, hey, send out a
Yeah.
direct mail piece. This generated, 12 calls because we had that call tracking number over the real office number, or it generated this many scans. Same thing with an email or whatever it may be, just to show that these other things are helping to build awareness and or hopefully appointments at that particular location or for that service.
Yeah, so it's not just the bottom of the funnel on a lead or an appointment. It's also there's a measurement of engagement, like is the target audience engaging with our outreach?
We even had an example a few years ago where there was a particular center that was really looking for some additional help and services, and the office manager was so willing to be a part of the process and thankful for getting the marketing support that
Wow.
she had it queued up with her office staff to ask people how they heard about the service. And so if someone had gotten the direct mail or had seen the ad or saw something on social, she was tracking for us exactly what they were, how it led people to the office to schedule that appointment. It's, a more traditional way of doing things, but it still got the job done and it helped us to be able to justify continuing to promote that particular center because it was something that was consumer driven, but it wasn't necessarily at the highest priority list organizationally with some of the other things we needed to market. But because we were showing results with them, we were able to still leave a small portion of the budget available for them. And in particularly the 2 or 3 tactics that they were getting the most feedback from patients on is what brought them to the practice.
I love that. That's a fantastic piece of like I don't have any data science team. Well, here's a very practical way. We've done it in B2B SaaS for a decade. You can't always trust the tracking to see like what are behaviors. So we ask on a form fill like how did
Right.
you hear about us? And we don't even sometimes don't even have a pick list. Just take the qualitative response and you'll be surprised. What's showing up a lot more today for us personally at Fresh Paint is searching on like through AI. Like
Yeah.
that is not something we can easily track, but it's
Yeah.
something that shows up qualitatively. And that's something you could just do right now. You could just implement that pretty quickly to get like a qualitative view of how people are finding you.
Absolutely. It's just further proof that sometimes some of the old school methods, can still work and did have their purpose, at that place and time and can still get the job done.
When have you been under pressure to abandon some of the brand efforts in the face of performance when you've been under budget pressure?
Sure. I mean, it's something that is, has been starting to percolate over the last year or two. I think everyone is in a much more growth oriented mode right now, just with a lot of the landscape of what's going on in healthcare from a reimbursement standpoint. Now that we're past, a couple of years past the pandemic and some of the federal funding that came across for health systems that existed at that point. So everyone is really in that kind of focused growth mode. So there's definitely a desire to continue with growth marketing and increasing that. But we do recognize the brand is still important. So I think it's just selectively picking which tactics to still utilize. Do we abandon one completely, or do we just have less of a frequency, or do we just use it at a
Sure.
certain time of the year? And so those are the things that we are playing around with. Obviously the brand tactic that tends to be the most costly is television, but there is still a place for that. One of the ways in which we're trying to make it more cost effective is getting much more heavily involved and connected over the last year or two. But there's still those opportunities to utilize traditional linear television because it has been effective for us, particularly in survey results for brand awareness and familiarity. And so, we still have it in the mix. It's just not as heavy as it once was. And that's where we're helping to supplement the growth tactics from a budgeting standpoint, as well as absorb any of the marketing cuts that we may need to just adjust appropriately because of what's going on in the overall um, marketing landscape from a healthcare perspective based on reimbursement.
What do you think will differentiate teams that kind of meet this moment and like the landscape is changing, but there's still growth goals to hit versus those that kind of stall and struggle? What will be the points of differentiation?
I think the key is figuring out the best way at their organization to keep the growth mindset and keep up with learning all the great opportunities that are coming and how quickly it's been evolving over the last year or two, and then complementing that with the more important branded opportunities and figuring out how to do that, because it's really not an either or. It's figuring out what the right mix is of the two and then just evolving them each appropriately, because brand needs to be evolved as well too. Those same traditional tactics just can't stay in the same way. Maybe again it's departing from one of the tactics, or it's just doing a little bit less of each of them. Or it's, again, it's just figuring out that right mix. But both brand and performance marketing need to both exist for an organization to be successful, and it's just finding the right mix and the happy intersection of the two to make it work.
Yeah, I learned a lot from you today, which was thinking like in practical ways, making sure that you had it's not just about setting up the tracking, it's making sure you have a clear goal and a clear way that you're thinking about how you're going to measure. So when you get into that conversation with leadership, that you've kind of you're buttoned up and you've been really thoughtful about it versus, hey, just trust me, like just
Right.
let me spend some money here and trust me.
Yeah. I think the key is looking for ways in which you can show that you are a revenue generating department, because it is possible. Just take credit for what you can at that point and then scale it as more capabilities come on where you can take credit for it. Again, utilizing, let's say, whether it's because of robust tech capabilities in a call center from a tracking standpoint, or again, it's the online scheduling. So if at the beginning you just have primary care and urgent care scheduling, take credit for that. As you get some of the specialties on, do that and figure out what the tolerance level is within the organization for that. And then just also figure out too whether there's that willingness to just have the initial appointment, or someone, or does the organization want to look at the lifetime value of that patient and downstream revenue, because that's the other component as well too. That starts getting a little trickier as to how that downstream revenue is defined. Is it simply another procedure or visit? Is it things like an MRI test or blood work? Is it all of the above? And so, but those are the types of conversations you would need to have. But I think it's clearly the crawl, walk, run approach will likely be the most successful, because without the leadership buy-in, it'll never work. And I think going too big at the beginning will cause more skepticism.
Yeah, I couldn't agree. Like, I think that you can't really get away in 2026 building brand without being able to like draw a line to the outcomes that the
Right.
organization wants. And if you just accept that and then work within those constraints, you're just going to have a way better chance to like be successful.
Yeah.
This has been super fun, Scott. Thank you for joining me on Marketing Rounds. I really appreciate it.
Happy to participate. Glad to see you again, Ray. It was a fun conversation.